The announcements. Oh, okay, so we're official now. Okay. So everyone must behave. Anyway, it's wonderful to see you all. Thanks for joining us. And those of you online, it's always good to have you with us as well. And Jim, thank you for your prayer. And yes, these are very, very challenging times in which we are living, and that will be a major theme of our course on the life and legacy of Francis Schaeffer. How many of you have read and know quite a bit about Francis Schaeffer, his life and ministry? Can I see a show of hands? And those of you online? Okay, all right. Well, I think you'll find that along with C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer was probably the most influential, significant Christian thinker of the 20th century. Now, there have been other great Christians, obviously, who've carried on phenomenal ministries in the 20th century. Billy Graham, obviously, Martin Luther King in the area of civil rights and so on. But as far as Christian thinkers, I think Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis really rank near the top. So his life and ministry is extremely fascinating. I think you'll find it very interesting to study and get to know. And his writings, of course, have had, like I said, a major impact on so many people. So we will have a book on the life and works of life and legacy of Francis Schaeffer. I am almost finished writing it. I've been working on that about 3 months. And so we will have it available in a couple of weeks, hopefully, and that'll be available on Amazon. I'll probably bring a few copies with me as well for those who just want to get one here in class. And other than that, we also will have a very thorough study guide, outlines to follow along with what we teach. It doesn't correlate to what we're talking about this evening or next week, but probably starting the third week. And so you can, if you'd like a spiral bound copy of the study guide outlines, just let us know. We need to get a count so that we tell the printer approximately how many we need. Let's see, any other preliminaries that I need to mention? Are there any questions anybody has about the course, how it's structured, kind of a generalization of what we'll be studying over the next 13 weeks? Anything that could use some clarification? Okay, let me check the chat. What's the Watchman? Well, the Watchman is an update on contemporary Christian developments in America, and Millie Atkinson does that. It's a very, very valuable resource for those who want to keep up with what's going on in Christianity in general, and of course, specifically here in Georgia and the Atlanta area as well. Anything else, Millie, you'd like to say about that?
It's an email.
It's an email. It's an email news.
How do I get on the mail?
Just contact the Areopagus through our website, and that would be info@theareopagus.org. I don't know about Francis Schaeffer, so that's you will in due time. Okay, and one last comment. Please mention the price of the class book. If you're talking about the book, I'm just about finished writing and submitting to publication. That will be about a $15 or $20 book. It's roughly about 160-page book. Okay, and so we will have a book that's very in depth on the life and works of Francis Schaeffer, and then we'll also have the study guide outline that I mentioned as well. Okay. All right. I guess that that is sufficient for that. All right. So, well, this Francis Schaeffer is really notable, particularly in the area of Christian cultural apologetics. That's not a particularly familiar term to a lot of people. Now, C.S. Lewis, we acknowledge as of course, a great Christian classical apologist, making very decisive arguments for the truth, the reliability of the Christian faith. And of course, he was an outstanding intellect in his day. And so basically, Lewis, in his works, like Mere Christianity and others, focused on what we call classical Christian apologetics, the rational and factual arguments for why we believe the Christian faith is true. So that's classical apologetics. Now, cultural apologetics applies biblical principles to the whole range of cultural issues that we have to deal with today. All the great social, cultural, political issues of our day, and how a comprehensive, holistic Christian worldview assesses and addresses these issues. And so that would be just in a very general sense, the difference in classical apologetics and cultural Christian apologetics. Now, just by way of a brief prelude to our preface, you have there the preface, the outline, but a prelude to that. If I were to ask you in contemporary America, what would you attribute most of our social and moral pathologies to? In other words, what are the most insidious forces that are at work very actively, very aggressively at work in America today that are so perverting and corrupting our culture? And I would say that number one, obviously, is what we call secularism. And secularism is a godless, humanistic approach to life. It excludes the reality of a divine creator and his involvement in our lives. It obviously excludes all the basic tenets of the Christian faith. So I would say secularism certainly would be the mother of all of our current social and moral and spiritual pathologies in America. But there's other matters as well that are to be taken very, very seriously in addition to secularism. There is socialism. And socialism is a transnational, global, the attempt to forge a transnational, global socialist political system in which government seeks to regulate and control virtually every aspect of our lives. We see that being played out in the daily news all the time. And that attempt by government to take over everything and control more and more of our lives, that comes at the expense not only of individual personal responsibility, but also at the expense of individual freedom. And so I think as Christians, we need to take that very, very seriously and realize that both in theory and in its history, socialism has always been an opponent of the Christian faith. Now, a third option or a third factor would be sexualism, making libertine sexual, quote, freedom in all of its many variations, an absolute dominant driving force in how we think and how we act. And when you look at this sexual revolution that's been going on, frankly, throughout all the 20th century, we usually attribute it to the 1960s because it got quite a boost in the 1960s. But the sexual revolution here in America actually started in the 1920s, just immediately after World War I. And so this emphasis on sexualizing every aspect of our lives and our culture is one that we seriously need to contend with. Last night at Perimeter Church, I went and heard Nancy Pearcey may be a familiar name to many of you. We brought Nancy in about, I believe, 4 years ago for an Areopagus forum, and she spoke on her book, Love Thy Body. And it's just a wonderful critique of the sexual revolution, the LGBTQ plus agenda, and so on, from a biblical Christian perspective. She did a wonderful job, as always. But sexualism. Now, when you think about it, when it comes to this sexualizing agenda, which now we understand is starting in elementary school, it used to be propagated, of course, primarily in universities, but now it's trickled down into even elementary level education. When you think about it, the ultimate sacred, or I'd say the most sacred holy sacrament of the sexual revolution would be abortion. Okay. Total unrestricted abortion. We're living in absolutely unprecedented times in American history. Our culture is becoming more and more akin to the pagan culture in which the early church had to operate. Many of the same values we have to contend with today, and it's mostly occurred over just the last 4 or 5 decades. So we have secularism to contend with, which, as I said, is kind of the mother of all the problems, a godless worldview and lifestyle. Socialism, sexualism, here's another one, racialism. And this is an absolute obsession with racial identity, an absolute obsession with race-based social and political agendas. And we know that in Christ, race should not be a factor in any respect, nor should sexual differences, male and female. But it is just pervasive, as you know, in American society today. Everything is being racialized, much to the fragmentation of our society and our culture. Now, lastly, in addition to secularism, socialism, sexualism, and racialism, I would say that anestheticism is a problem. Now, that's probably not a very familiar term. Basically, what we're talking about here is the loss of normal sensations and awareness. In other words, the dulling of our sensitivities to normal stimulation, anestheticism. It comes from constant exposure to audio and visual overstimulation, which we're just inundated with today. I mean, think about it. You can hardly go into a restaurant and carry on a conversation with someone without being blasted with the latest, frankly, trash music. So overexposure to audio, visual overstimulation, social media, video games, frenetic music, television, nonstop entertainment, and so on. So these are all forces that I think we need to take very, very seriously. And those who seek to control our lives and radically transform America want to secularize everything, totally eliminate God from the public square, socialize everything. They want to sexualize everything, all the way down to 5- and 6-year-olds, racialize everything, and they want to anesthetize every aspect of our society and culture as well. You know, if you can dull people's sensitivities and sensibilities, then obviously propaganda is far more effective, propaganda and indoctrination. Let me, if you didn't, let me write those down, by the way.
Jeffrey,
Yes, please.
there's a real strong effort, seems very wide effort as well, to redefine terms, redefine meanings of words.
Absolutely.
How do you mix that into what this list you're making? Is it just
Well, I think when you look at modern history and propaganda efforts going all the way back to the French Revolution, even before that, probably, yes, those that want to control our lives and dominate society oftentimes are absolute masters when it comes to redefining key terms, terminology that we depend upon for the clarity of communication. But they're very astute in terms of twisting, distorting the meaning of keywords, or just inventing keywords that sound somewhat plausible.
Like truth.
Well, like truth, yeah. I can't think of too many words that have been more perverted and misused than God, Christianity, truth, as you say, so on. So again, for the benefit of those of you who are joining us online, secularism, socialism, sexualism, racialism, and anestheticism. And that last one is a real key, because as I said, if you can dull people's sensitivities, dull their ability to think clearly and think critically, then that's a real key to people accepting the rest of this agenda. Any comment real quickly, and then we'll move on. Anything that could use clarification?
Brave New World
Right out of the Brave New World playbook. Yes, absolutely.
And 1984 Newspeak.
Newspeak in 1984. So when you think about it, Brave New World is really just the precursor to 1984. I tell you, we are in the throes of Brave New World today. Yes, Bruce?
And I think it's important to remember that the purpose behind all these is the same. They are to drive a wedge into society, to separate it into competing groups.
Yes.
And to the extent that the groups then are in contest or in conflict with each other, ultimately they will clamor for someone to come and settle the argument, which is where government, of course, is famous for creating problems and then running on a platform of solving
Their own
That's exactly
problems.
what's going on.
Yes, yeah, well put. Yeah. And again, it's such an explicitly anti-Christian agenda, to say the least. Anything else, and then we'll move right on here. Yes.
What is Brave New World? I never heard that before. What is that?
This is a book written in 1932 by Aldous Huxley. And it talks about essentially what I've just been laying out, and that is an authoritarian government that has emerged with the agenda of keeping the citizens entertained, their sensibilities overwhelmed, sexualizing everything. See, the government wants to control most everything, but there's a trade-off here. They also, a government like we're talking about, will actually promote sexual libertinism. In other words, you know, that's purely up to you. No regulations, no controls over people's sexual behavior. And the idea there is, again, to sexualize people so that we just lose, again, our moral sensibilities in every area of life. And people who are absolutely addicted, not only to drugs and psychotropic drugs, by the way, but also to sex and entertainment and so on. Those are the kind of people that are easily manipulated. And so that's basically the gist of Brave New World. And then 1984 actually takes it even a step further from authoritarianism to totalitarianism, where government truly controls every aspect of life. All right, well, if you're, let's take a look here at the outline for this evening and the preface to the course. See, Francis Schaeffer, a retrospective and commentary on his life and legacy. Now, we're not going to mention Schaeffer very much tonight or next week, but the following week, we'll get into the main substance of the course. And I want to start with this theme, the times they are changing. And those of you who were into popular music back in the 60s, you knew Bob Dylan and so on, you know that was one of Bob Dylan's biggest, most well-known songs, The Times They Are Changing.
Why don't you sing
Well,
He doesn't have his harmonic.
Bob Dylan didn't sing it.
that's a good way to clear the room. So I think I'll contain myself if you don't mind. What's that?
Didn't you hire Bob Dylan to come and sing for us?
Well, he was unavailable. Otherwise, I would have reached out. All right, now, since the dawn of recorded music in the early 1900s, popular music has oftentimes functioned as kind of a cultural barometer. If you think about it, it measures the temperature in society. For over 200 years in American history, but especially since the early 20th century, you've had songwriters and musicians who have accessed the muse to recount the consequential events of our day and argue various social and political and religious points of view. Now, popular music has often reflected the zeitgeist, the spirit of our age. Okay. The novelist John Steinbeck once noted that folk and popular music express a people's sharpest statement about who they are and what they believe. He said, if you want to know the values, the real values in a society and culture, listen to their popular music, or going back 100 years ago, you'd say listen to their folk music, essentially. Again, this idea of the great influence of popular and folk music, now that may be a bit outdated now in the last couple of decades, as we have the emergence of social media and so on, but music is still nonetheless very, very significant, influences so many people's values. It's not just an entertainment medium. It basically helps inform and condition the way people think. Now, this has certainly cause for alarm considering the state of popular music over the last several decades. So when you think about it, do Britney Spears and Madonna and Eminem and Lady Gaga and gangster rappers and so on really speak for most young people today? If so, this truly is a horrifying prospect, and it's a very damning indictment of our culture. Okay. Now, let's take a look here at the most prolific songwriter of the 20th century, and that was Bob Dylan. Like all songwriters, Dylan's output was a mixed bag when it came to quality. Dylan wrote dozens of songs that were absolutely outstanding compositions by any standard. On the other hand, he wrote far more songs that were sloppy and worthless. Now, this has always been the case, though, when you think about it, with creative people, whether they're painters, other kinds of artists, musicians, songwriters, or whatever. And that is, occasionally, they seem to be inspired with something that truly is remarkable and that people might even remember and sing or watch or go back and visit decades later, maybe even centuries later. Take, for example, Charles Wesley, perhaps the most prolific Christian hymnist in history. Now, Charles Wesley reportedly wrote over 4,000 hymns. How many do you know? Most Christians know two out of 4,000. They know Christ the Lord is risen today. By the way, if you're involved in a church and on Easter morning, they don't sing Christ the Lord is risen today, I would suggest you start a class action lawsuit against the church, okay? So Christ, the Lord is risen today, one of the great songs ever written. Another one that you know, of course, is Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Now, other or older Christians might also recognize 3 or 4 other Charles Wesley songs like, And Can It Be That I Should Gain, Oh, for 1,000 Tongues to Sing, Amazing Love, and a couple of others, Love Divine, All Love Excelling, and so on. But at best, there might be perhaps 5 or 6 songs out of 4,000 that Charles Wesley wrote that have survived through the centuries, and we still remember and value today. Tell you, it's an absolute work of genius to be able to write a song that decades later or even centuries later, people, you know, still enjoy singing and derive so much meaning from it. Now, in 1963, Bob Dylan wrote a folk protest song that's become a true modern classic, and it's The Times They Are A-Changin', perhaps the most representative song of the past 60 years. The song not only helped launch the youth rebellion of the 1960s, but it also symbolized the drift of American society and culture and politics over time. So I will serenade you with Bob Dylan's version of his song. I will not sing it, however, but you are welcome to sing along. So here you have the lyrics there in front of you. Now think about the lyrics here in the context of how things have changed over the last 60 years. This song is in some respects, quote, prophetic in the most general sense of the term.
If your time is worth saving,
Wait, Bob.
then you better.
God created the human voice to sing. Here is the standard. Very few of us can sing like that. Do you realize that? What's that?
Another blessing.
And thank God for that. So what struck you in that song? Some of you probably know that by heart. I mean, but
Well, there's a protest attitude in here, there's a division between father and mother.
yes, a generation gap, as we used to call it. Yeah. What else kind of stands out in your mind, Bruce?
Surprised me, this question is the first shall be last and vice versa. It's very biblical.
Yeah, and the thing about Dylan was he was raised in a secular Jewish home, but he was somewhat familiar with the Bible, and he oftentimes would incorporate biblical themes into a lot of his music. In fact, for about 3 years in the late 70s, early 80s, he claimed to be a professing Christian.
That's what I was gonna say, he wrote some interesting songs, like,
Yes.
You gotta serve somebody.
Yeah, serve somebody.
Serve the Lord,
Right.
but you gotta serve somebody.
Yeah. Another one of my favorites, I ain't gonna go to hell for anyone. And yeah, so he recorded 3 explicitly Christian albums, 78, 79, 80, 81. And if you ever have a chance to look at his some of his online videos of some of those concerts, it's very hard to imagine that he wasn't just absolutely sincere about that. But again, that phase didn't last very long. And nobody, I mean, all we can do is speculate as to why that's the case. What else from that song?
Everything is very dialectical. Everything is black and white.
Yes. So, well, that being the case, then what would be the source of the dialect? What's the problem, and what's this? Well, I don't see him offering a solution,
Right.
but what do you see as?
The old way of doing things.
That's right. The old ways are dying.
Get out of the new road.
Yes.
So,
The ways of the past, traditions are no longer applicable. to the 60s generation. Now, by the way, if someone were to accede to the theories of evolution, it would stand to reason that humankind is constantly evolving. And you would assume that, at least in general, each generation should be, quote, superior mentally or otherwise than its predecessors and all. So yeah, that fits in well with a evolutionary view of life as well. Yes.
The 1963 was probably when your average baby boomer was starting to wield their own power.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the first thrust
Mhm.
of the baby boomers
Mhm.
were making their impact known.
Mhm.
And they were coming in on the end of the baby boom. I have noticed that we get the crumbs. But, 1957 means I'm getting the crumbs of the people who were probably 20 in 1963.
Yeah, they would have been about 18 from 45 to
And so
63.
Baby boomer
Yeah.
was born in 46, the last was in 64.
Right.
When they
46 to 64, that's the general range for baby boomers. Okay.
But your average person in 1963 was, I remember Paul McCartney talking about their feeling was that the whole world was going to blow up with the nuclear bomb any minute,
Mhm.
and they were going to do it. They blank, well
Mhm.
pleased.
Mhm.
And I think he was actually specific in his wording,
Mhm.
but that's the why.
Yeah.
Is, when is the whole world going to blow up? It
Right.
can happen any second. So
Okay.
they're going to get everything they could
Yeah.
in that moment.
Yeah. In that case, you can resurrect old ancient Epicureanism. This idea: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. So might as well grab for everything you can get in the present. Yeah. Good point. Yes,
I do
Kathy.
think, circling back to the old ways,
Mhm.
scripture tells us we're to stick to the old ways
Mhm.
and to value those things.
That's
And I
right.
think that in this is just the seed of deception that goes throughout human history.
Yeah, there are
Something
eternal
better.
truths. That's what the Bible is all about. Eternal truths that are relevant regardless of where you live, when you lived, or whatever. So this would be a refutation of that. Or I guess you could just look at this as the fact that all societies and cultures, all nations in human history are flawed. Some considerably more than others, but they're all flawed and they're all corrupt to some extent. So perhaps he's playing off of that as well. But you're right. I mean, this does seem to be a total rejection of absolute truth, which is what Scripture is all about. Bruce?
But I would be tempted, outside of the fact that it has a vibe which is specific to its place and time,
Mhm.
from a musical perspective, folk
Mhm.
music and all that.
Mhm.
You could pick this concept up and move it back 20 or 40 years, forward 20 or 40 years. We could have sung the same thing, and maybe they'd have sung it in the desert with Moses, and stuff. Times they are changing. Everybody begins to, this is part of the pageant of what happened
Yeah.
to humanity.
Yeah.
So
Well, and again,
that's another story.
all societies and cultures are flawed, aren't they? They're all sin-ridden. And some, however, are considerably worse than others. But when you're comparing, for instance, present-day America in 1963 or present-day America in 2022, if you're comparing America to some absolute perfection, some utopian society that's perfect, which is what socialism is all about. It's the drive to create an ideal utopian society. Well, no nation can ever live up to those standards. So for instance, if we're assessing the state of America and American history and our heritage and so on, we have much to be thankful for, because when you compare it to any other nation, probably in all of human history, it is relatively good. In fact, actually, it's relatively great compared to everything else. But see, a secular socialist perspective takes God out of the equation. And so it's all about us creating a perfect society on earth. And it always ends up in miserable failure, and usually just terrible tyranny, like we saw in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, present day communist China, and so on.
Bob had a comment.
Yes, Bob, please. You'll have to unmute.
Well, what you just said was sort of the line I was going. I noticed that he doesn't bother with moral rightness at all, but he subscribes totally to might makes right, and we saw that in the French Revolution. We saw that in the Bolshevik Revolution. We saw that in Pol Pot. We saw it many times. The morals was not taken into consideration. It was who was the strongest. And basically who has the weapons is what it boils down to.
I think there is a moral tone to this, but the basis for it is certainly seemingly anything but a biblical moral base. In other words, he's arguing the times are changing for the better, a better society, awaits us. And that is in itself, a system of morality. The problem is, on what basis, does your moral code rest? Yeah. Well, let's move on here. Next section there you see in your outline is the music of revolution. Now, this is just a brief excerpt from a larger work I wrote 3 years ago called American Crisis. Cultural Marxism and the Culture War, a Christian Response. Now, with the invention of motion pictures and recorded music, radio and television, all this happens, as you know, in the first half of the 20th century, left-wing ideologues realized that these new mass communication technologies could be used to great effect for propagandistic purposes, and ultimately for social control. Now, of course, most popular culture is just merely crass entertainment. It's just silly, trivial, banal, inconsequential. We know that overwhelmingly, that's what pop music and pop culture is. Nonetheless, some popular entertainment is truly significant, and its cumulative effect on viewers and listeners can be absolutely substantial, either for better or for worse. Oftentimes it's for worse. Now, many political leftists understood the potential of mass entertainment, the new technologies. They understood this from the very outset, which is why they were very eager to use these fascinating new communications industries to promote their left-wing agenda. Unlike most conservatives, they understood full well that culture drives politics, not vice versa. Politics, as you've undoubtedly heard the phrase, is downstream of culture. Okay? What becomes normative and preferred in society in general, oftentimes will be legislated and enacted into laws. Now, left-wing radicals eventually developed two tactics to accomplish their goal of an international Marxist revolution. So two tactics. First of all and foremost, of course, was the great patron saint of 20th century Marxism, Vladimir Lenin, who, as you know, led the Bolshevik Revolution that seized control in 1917. He died about 7 years later, but nonetheless, a very, very influential person in 20th century history. Now, Vladimir Lenin and other Marxist intellectuals, they urged left-wing actors and musicians to use their art as a form of agitprop And as you see there in your notes, what's agitprop? Well, that's agitation, constantly complaining, critiquing the way things currently are in any society, and propaganda in order to promote an international communist agenda. Now, by the time Bob Dylan emerged in the early 1960s, the American left had already infiltrated popular music and Hollywood, I should add, going all the way back to the 1930s with the folk protest songs of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and many, many others I could cite. Their music, by the way, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s and all, were not overtly revolutionary, but they oftentimes offered very sharp critiques of American society and culture and politics and American values in general. Now, by the way, if you listen to a lot of that music, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, the Weavers, people like that, a lot of what they're saying is true. It's a true critique. Again, no society is ideal, to say the least. The problem is, what's the alternative? And their alternative is far worse than the status quo typically. Now, as the 1960s became increasingly chaotic, in particular, when do the 60s really start to just unravel and get totally out of control? Is there an event that happened that you can sort of date it back to, perhaps? Far before Woodstock, yeah. The American involvement in Vietnam will become definitely a factor.
Kent State?
Well before Kent State.
Assassination of Kennedy.
Absolutely, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, say. The left was fairly contained up to that point because they liked him, his style and whatever, and they thought eventually he would come around and promote their agenda. But after Kennedy's assassination, and you get Lyndon Johnson, who has no charisma, you find things just very quickly starting to unravel. Okay, so with the death of Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson taking over, folk and rock protest music becomes considerably more explicit and a whole lot more aggressive. Now, whether promoting political or social revolution, either political or sexual revolution, or simply emphasizing feelings and emotions and impulses over facts and reason at the expense of moral consciousness, all of it seemed to harmonize. So whether you're a sexual revolutionary or a political revolutionary, or just one of these who is advocating that we should just follow, our impulses, well, it all actually kind of correlates in terms of what's developing here in the 1960s. Pamela?
The big thing that you missed, it wasn't just that JFK was assassinated, but not too long after that, only a couple of years, was the first big anti-war, anti-Vietnam march on Washington.
Yeah, and of course,
everything after that changed very quickly.
Yeah, and of course, Kennedy actually got us into Vietnam, didn't he? But it was on a limited basis. But then Johnson, again, this president who really commands no interest, no respect among youth, especially, he's the one that really ramps up the involvement in Vietnam, and that also is going to cause a great uproar. Now, much of the music of the mid-60s and beyond was also drug-inspired, which was itself a revolutionary medium when you think about it. The drug culture correlated very well with countercultural radicalism of youth who had been taught that what really matters in life is to express yourself in an uninhibited way and celebrate your freedom. And that's where we get, the sex and drugs and rock and roll kind of mantra. Mind-altering drugs and mind-altering music correlate perfectly with left-wing propaganda efforts to break down the normal cognitive and moral boundaries and disrupt the sensibilities of young people so as to reprogram them for revolution, sexual revolution and political revolution. So that's primarily how the left will try to exploit the entertainment industry, from again, Hollywood to later TV and obviously music and every other medium. But very interestingly, there's another alternative position taken by hardcore leftists. And this would be in contrast to what Lenin and others were advocating. This is in contrast to that agitprop kind of music. And this would come primarily from a musicologist and a neo-Marxist theoretician by the name of Theodore Adorno. Theodore Adorno advocated a different approach to undermining traditional Western values, not just outright propaganda trying to write interesting, catchy songs that also have revolutionary, revolutionary messages, whether it's sexual or political revolutionary messages. But Theodore Adorno is one who is absolutely contemptuous of popular culture in general. He regarded popular culture as petit bourgeois, in other words, just the music of the mindless middle class, frivolous and counter-revolutionary. Adorno scorned popular music. He considered it trivial. He considered it to be very insipid and very banal, which of course, the vast majority of it was and always has been. But for Adorno, the great challenge for the true revolutionary and the socially conscious artist in the midst of such an unjust, such an ugly, such an exploitative capitalistic system like America is to expose the phoniness and the utter bankruptcy of such a culture and thereby increase the level of discontent and the level of alienation among the masses. Now, what that requires is new cultural expressions that heighten people's sense of frustration and anger and rebellion. See, a lot of this music, a lot of this revolutionary music and all, 60s and earlier and all, a lot of it's very creative, and he's saying that, no, that's not what we need, because people will listen to music like that and oftentimes they'll miss the revolutionary intent of the music because it's a nice song and they'll sing along and whatever and not really ingest, what the message truly is. So Adorno regards modern bourgeois culture as innately repressive, conformist, and fascist. Therefore, true revolutionaries, according to him, should have absolutely nothing to do with mainstream culture and mainstream cultural values. For Adorno, the only authentic music then would have to be non-commercial. Now, wait a minute. If something's totally non-commercial, hardly anybody would want to listen to it, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose of a commercial music industry, to catch people's attention. But yeah, yeah. But see, he says, if you make nice music that has, again, kind of subtle revolutionary themes, that's not the way to spark a revolution. And by the way, according to Adorno, America is just rotten to the core. It's fascist. And so the true artist would want to produce art that exposes the ugliness of American society and culture. So that would have to be non-commercial. It would have to be a type of art or music that's absolutely disruptive. In the case of music itself, it would have to be music that is discordant, that is dissonant, that is atonal, so as to dramatize the ugliness and the social injustice inherent in America and in the capitalist West in general. Music that's highly structured, music that conveys a sense of joy and peace and harmony is little more than a tacit endorsement, he says, of the fascistic status quo. Okay. Therefore, the true purpose of music and every other art form is to disrupt any sense of peace and tranquility, to subvert everything that's inspiring and uplifting, so that you can promote what the neo-Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht called the estrangement effect. In other words, you don't want people to have a sense of loyalty, patriotism, or whatever, or even admiration for their society and culture. You want people who hate everything about their culture, and that's fertile ground for a radical revolution. So the ultimate goal, whether Theodore Adorno realized it or not, was a kind of spiritual warfare that he's advocating. We know that because we're, biblical Christians. Ultimately, all of this stuff that masquerades as political or even moral is actually a part of spiritual warfare. What these people are attempting to do, as Adorno sees it, is to reprogram people's minds, reprogram our sensibilities and our sensitivities so as to thwart any awareness or any pursuit of any kind of transcendent spiritual inclinations. If your mind is constantly in the gutter, you are not going to be pursuing transcendent spiritual truth, to say the least.
Where would be an example of Adorno's music as far as what we hear today?
Well, unfortunately for you, I'm going to play some.
I mean, I've never heard of Adorno before.
Yeah.
He wasn't a musician.
Yeah, he was actually a musicologist and a
But,
musician.
More of a critic.
do you hear, would he be in like a movie that we would recognize or something of that nature? Or is it just?
I've never seen him portrayed in a movie or anything like that. Now, among Marxist philosopher theoreticians, he's very prominent and all. But in popular
It
culture,
didn't make it into we don't generally, follow his music.
hopefully not.
Is he American?
Most sane people do not. But I will subject you to a bit of something that he would probably greatly admire and promote.
Where was he from?
He was German,
Okay.
Theodore Adorno, and he was part of what was called, after World War I, the Frankfurt School. And this was, are you familiar with the Frankfurt School? This was a bunch of Marxist intellectuals that gathered primarily around Frankfurt, Germany. In fact, they started an institution, and it was to promote international communism, Marxism, and so on. Now, after Hitler came to power, these communists had to scatter, okay? Now, at the time that Hitler comes to power in 1933, there is one communist nation in the world, and that would be, Russia, the Soviet Union, okay? Very interesting. None of these communist Marxists fled to the Soviet Union. Where did they go? Well, all the free countries. Holland, Switzerland, France, Great Britain, and the United States. So he came to the United States along with several others that were very notable. And they continued to propagate their Marxist ideology.
Consequence of open borders.
Well, he immigrated legally, but so. Yeah, that's right. See, Columbia University in New York City became kind of the ground central for these Frankfurt School theoreticians, philosophers, and so on. So, all right, so think about an art form, a musical art form that Theodore Adorno might find to be very effective in promoting his agenda. Well, how about heavy metal rock? Okay. How about punk rock? How about gangster rap? Music forms like that. See, all it does is just deaden people's sensitivities, and that's exactly what the left wants to do.
You left out Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Well, I don't even know how to characterize their music, you know. Now, any music or other art form that doesn't ultimately promote the revolution, according to Adorno, would be inauthentic music. It would be repugnant, and obviously it's counter-revolutionary. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is really entertain people, help, you know, create a sense of joy and peace and happiness and so on, because we live in just a despicable country. And all of our art needs to be focused on exposing just how degraded and despicable our society and culture
That
is.
explains a lot of the movies that you see. It's like, why would I go see something that's that disgusting? And why would an actor be in that movie? Because it's been, I'd say within the last 5 years, there's been a really horrific change in the movies. You don't go and, you know, they're not pleasant to go watch.
Yeah, and I think that's probably been overwhelmingly the case, but probably worse now than ever. Yeah. My wife and I were talking about how the last time we went to a movie to see, to a theater to see a movie, of course, was before the COVID epidemic, back in 2019, I believe, and we haven't seen a standard, you know, commercial movie since then. Okay, now, not only music, say, can be used in a revolutionary sense to pollute and degrade a society, but likewise, technology in general can be cleverly manipulated so as to have a similar mind-altering effect. Now, our previous Areopagus seminar course was entitled The Inner Journey. And we spent all that time exploring the rich tradition of contemplative Christian spirituality and just very, very rich literature. And so that would be absolutely the antithesis to what we're talking about here, what the left wants to do to our society. And the worst thing in their mind would be for people to develop a deep spiritual life. So they're all about just the opposite. Now, the goal is to promote the kind of, quote, libertarian socialism that the Marxist intellectual Herbert Marcuse advocated. In other words, a kind of libertine pseudo-liberation that can readily be manipulated by an authoritarian government and used as a gateway to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, really. See? Government control over every aspect of our lives, except we would be totally free to do what? Oh, well, to consume pornography and other forms of sexual liberation. And of course, we'd be free to indulge in drugs. In fact, if they can get us hooked on pornography and drugs and horrible music, that fits in very well with their agenda. In the process, libertarian socialism calls for the elimination of the last residual influences of biblical faith. And this is precisely what Francis Schaeffer warns against in his lectures and his books. Okay. Now, when you see there in your notes that term libertarian socialism, if you're fairly politically astute, you'll think those two words don't go together. Because when we think about libertarianism, we're talking about an ideology, a political ideology that calls for minimalist government. And when we're talking about socialism, of course, we're talking about a political ideology that advocates, government control, maximalist government in some respects. So libertarian socialism, it's brilliant. And again, it's put forth by Herbert Marcuse. And the idea here is that government should control most every aspect of our lives, but you can indulge to your heart's content in, again, sex, anything related to sex and drugs and whatever, because then you're frankly more easily manipulated and controlled. Okay. So it's really brilliant. And if you're not familiar with Herbert Marcuse, you might look him up and read a little bit about his theory of libertarian socialism. All right, so this takes us to the music of John Cage. Has anybody heard of him? Okay, good. Oh, more than I would have thought. Okay. John Cage, you see the dates of his life there, span most of the 20th century. John Cage composed the kind of music that Theodore Adorno would have heartily endorsed. Cage was an American composer and a music theorist who in the early 1950s began performing kind of an avant-garde style of music that he called aleatoric music. Now, if you haven't studied music theory, then the term aleatoric probably doesn't mean much to you, but aleatoric music is essentially a form of improvisational music based on structured randomness. Think about that, music based on structured randomness? That sounds rather contradictory, in which various pitches and rhythms, or what they called free tempo, are ad-libbed repeatedly throughout without any coordination with the rest of the ensemble. So if you're playing the piccolo or you're playing, whatever, saxophone or whatever, or the drums for that matter, you do your own thing, and so do the other musicians. And
Is that what an orchestra does when they're warming up?
well, that's true. How would you like to sit through that though, and that be the final product? Sorry. Yeah, that's well put. Now, the effect of aleatoric music is anti-aesthetic. It's basically musical chaos, in keeping with John Cage's nihilistic philosophy of life. So all he's doing is writing and presenting music in accord with his philosophy of life. And he's a nihilist. He's an atheist. He doesn't believe that there's any meaning and purpose in life whatsoever. In fact, the nihilist will hold that this life is just a sick, dirty joke. We would like to think that our lives matter for something, but they don't at all, see. And you live your life striving to accomplish something, well, it doesn't matter. All you do is die and rot. And so that's sort of nihilism in a very dark nutshell. Now, Cage is probably best known for this brilliant 1952 composition that he called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. It was 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence in which musicians played no instruments and the only sounds were those of the surrounding environment. Wow, what a work of genius. And that's what he's best known for, by the way. The rest of his music was worse.
Silence is a good thing.
Well, yeah, if used, in a spiritual sense. Now, in a 1957 lecture that he called Experimental Music, John Cage described his music as, quote, a purposeless play, not a purposeful, a purposeless play, and an affirmation of life. It's purposeless, and it's an affirmation of life. That's because he's a nihilist. Life has no meaning and purpose. Again, it's just a dirty trick. It's not an attempt to bring order out of chaos, but simply an expression of waking up to the very life that we're living, very life that he was living, apparently. Now, one of Cage's pieces is called HPS-CHD. What's that word look like? Harpsichord, right? Harpsichord. And what he did in that was integrate music from Mozart with some of Cage's original music. Now, I'm going to enlighten you for a couple of minutes with John Cage's harpsichord. But by the way, if you would like to dance or sing along, don't feel inhibited. It gets worse. This is the good part. I'm sorry, I know you would like to hear the whole thing. That's probably about all that we need to play, because I think you get the point.
Thank you for turning to that.
You're quite welcome.
When you
Yes.
address the fact that God created music,
Mm.
that is a complete perversion of it.
Absolutely. And I think whether it's realized or not, that's basically how, well, let's just say that's how Satan uses it. Yeah. Yeah, it's an absolute total perversion of one of the greatest gifts of God. Mhm. Pamela?
Who really took this serious?
Well, among elite musicologists, he was held in very high esteem. But again, consider the source there, elite musicologists. Mhm.
Ivory Towers.
Yes, yes, So now, yes, Bruce?
The piece of his I've always liked is called Symphony for Seven Timpanis and Man with a Tennis Ball.
Seriously? I don't have that on my greatest hits collection.
On stage, a man comes out bouncing a tennis ball. He lines up two of them and tries to get the ball to bounce from one to the first to the second. And he gets that done. He puts a third and tries to get, maybe it doesn't quite work. So you got to move all around a bit and gets it. And when he gets it, so the roll bounces on all seven, the piece is over.
So it is a work of genius.
It is.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's something else going on here as well, which in that interwar period, there was a general feeling in the whole classical music world that we had kind of reached the end of what we could do with the forms that we had with the symphony, and the concerto, and the sonata, and so forth, and with the tonal structure and dominant sevenths and all sorts of issues, and that we had to find they were looking. People who were doing it for musical purposes as opposed to for philosophical or what have you purposes, were looking for some way of structuring the music, and that's where this so-called 12-tone music or aleatory music or whatever came from. And indeed, a row was generated at random, but then you took that and used that as the structure. Bach did the same thing, except that his themes were a melody that you could understand.
Melodic.
And then he turned them and made them into the accompaniment and so forth, and wove them together into a complex piece. And they did the same thing with these, but they started out with something which was generated at random, often by throwing the I Ching or dice or whatever to get something which had no conscious sort of structure.
Yeah, and when you look at
monumentally unsuccessful as far as something which had any real impact on the culture. And you have people like Berg and Schoenberg and Webern and so forth, who we still listen to Schoenberg's violin string quartets, but they're something that you have to learn to like.
Yeah, yeah, and some of his was just totally off the scale radical. Yeah, good point. Well, now in his book, The Church at the End of the 20th Century, Francis Schaeffer, he wrote that book, by the way, in 1970. And Schaeffer used John Cage's music as an example of the spiritual dissolution and cultural dissonance in modern America. And by the way, the rest of Western civilization as well. And basically, Schaeffer was arguing that we live in a post-Christian society and culture that's becoming increasingly dominated by secular philosophical presuppositions. I don't think that comes as a great awakening to any of us. More and more people reject objective, absolute moral standards And more people reject that there is any real transcendent meaning and purpose to life. So when you reject God, you're totally on your own. And given our sin nature, you can imagine the depths of depravity to which, an individual, or for that matter, a society culture can sink. Now, Schaeffer uses a really interesting story here to illustrate the effect of John Cage's music. And he writes, quote, "The irony of such a situation is illustrated by an event that happened to John Cage, the modern composer who writes music from a theory of chance." In other words, every note and whatever is just by chance, random selection, and so on. Now, Leonard Bernstein, probably familiar with him, once offered John Cage the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Cage directed some of his own chance music, and when it was over, he started to take his bows when he thought he heard steam escaping from the steam pipes. Then he realized, no, it wasn't the steam pipes leaking, it was the musicians hissing. As Cage explains it, it must have been a very traumatic experience. Schaeffer goes on to say, "But I've often thought about what I would like to have said to the musicians who were playing that music that night. I'm sure that if I had an hour with those musicians, that I would have found that most of those musicians really believed philosophically exactly what John Cage believes, that the universe begins with the impersonal, in other words, there's no creator God, and operates exclusively on the basis of time and chance. There's no order or purpose." Why were these musicians hissing then? They were hissing because they did not like the results of their own philosophy of life when they heard it in the medium to which they were sensitive, the medium of music. They were hissing themselves. Does that make sense? Now,
On what did he base the presupposition that those musicians were philosophically?
well, on what basis did Francis Schaeffer base that? Just on kind of a generic average, I'd say, and that is most of them pretty secular people. Some more aggressively secular than others, of course, but most of them would have thought that no, human life is just a chance occurrence.
I just don't know if I would have left to that conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think your critique's justified. On the other hand, he's making a good point. Pamela?
But don't you think sometimes the only things that musicians like is the music that they really like? And to play music that they thought was repulsive, I'm sure some of those people found that music was repulsive.
Yeah.
They escaped because by then they already didn't like a lot of the early rock and roll. They didn't care for any of that stuff. And so I mean, then you get this guy who supposedly was a classic musician. And he comes and he basically tears up your music. I don't think they would have been happy with
and rock and roll is very structured, as are some forms of jazz and blues. It's very structured music, the opposite of this.
But to Bruce's point, he probably assumed they would appreciate playing something other than Mozart.
Right, but it's just absolutely abjectly ugly, isn't it?
I think they were insulted by what they had to play. They were insulted.
Yeah. And being made in the image of God, we do have these inherent sensibilities for beauty, see? And that's one thing that Francis Schaeffer will emphasize repeatedly in his works, and that is in Christianity, we focus almost exclusively on what is true and what is good, morally good, true and good. Now, what we oftentimes ignore is the beautiful. See, if you look at the Plato's kind of triad of values, we should devote our lives to what is true, to what is good, and what is beautiful. And I think Schaeffer, again, will come back to that theme from time to time. Beauty matters a great deal. And this is not beautiful music, okay, but you haven't heard anything yet. All right, real quickly here. Over the last 50 years, musical expressions of chaos have become mainstream. They're popularized, like I said, in mediums like punk rock, heavy metal, gangsta rap, and things like that. Such, quote, music combines the very worst aspects of both revolutionary approaches to music. In other words, the sexual and the political themes that Vladimir Lenin would have approved of, and the kind of atonal, non-harmonic, discordant sounds that Theodore Adorno would have applauded. So a lot of the music we hear today in our popular culture is just the ideal blend of Lenin and Adorno. It's propaganda music, oftentimes, sexual usually, and then it's just mind-numbing. And of course, any music that is not mentally healthy obviously cannot be spiritually healthy. I mean, obviously. And yet we're just inundated with that. Anytime you go out in public, you're probably exposed to that to some extent. Now, and I'll close on this. One such expression of this kind of nihilistic, discordant music is the free jazz of Ornette Coleman. For instance, his musical piece called First Take. Is anyone familiar with Ornette Coleman? Are you? Okay, all right. So here is a blast from Ornette Coleman. In fact, this might be one of his most popular compositions. Now, you may think that I'm going to cue in the middle of the song. No, this is the beginning of the song. Okay. Well, because I respect you, because I respect you and I love you, I won't subject you to, by the way, that's about a 16-minute piece.
You can tell the talent of the musician.
Oh, sure,
And for them
sure.
to be able to put that together.
That's right.
There's some magnificent work going on.
You're quite
I'm
right.
just sort of like, I'm curious.
And let me just briefly interject and then please continue. Yeah, every piece of music has a philosophy behind it. And every piece of music, I guess we could even say, has a theology behind it. And that theology conditions philosophy. There's a direct connection there. Okay, so what about this? What is the spiritual component in this? What is it conveying? Please go ahead.
Oh, well, jazz music, I believe, had not quite sure where it started, but I think I know it was New Orleans brothels, wasn't it? Wasn't that the beginning?
That would have been a center. a center of
And
modern
so,
jazz,
I
but
mean,
yeah.
some of the jazz musicians that are a little more listenable,
Yeah. Yeah.
are just brilliant.
Yes,
in
yes, they
that,
are.
But,
Mhm. Mhm.
so I'm not sure their theology would have been one that Christ approved of, but.
Well, if they're seeking to express beauty, then I guess, that comes in part from, being made in the divine image. Although I think usually among relatively sane people, there is usually kind of a consensus of what constitutes beautiful music and otherwise. Yeah.
One of the things I'm hoping you'll cover is in the cacophony of 2022. And I'm kind of trying to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit
Mhm.
and trying to trust that more, and I'm hoping you'll cover that in this
Mhm.
course,
Mhm.
whereby I can trust my intuition to
Mhm.
believe that God is speaking to me.
Yes.
And I'm finding that I have a lot of paralysis of analysis going on these days.
Mhm. I think you're quite right. I mean, we're just absolutely inundated with propaganda of every conceivable kind, and well, see, that was basically what we focused on in our previous course. We will touch on it in this course as well, because Schaeffer and Ray was sharing with me his vintage copy of one of Schaeffer's early books, Truth Spirituality.
Mhm.
I believe that was his third major work. But that's basically what we focused on in our previous course. But we, because Schaeffer will constantly come back to that theme, we will touch on that. But primarily, we'll in looking at his life and his greatest contributions, it's to help us assess the state of our society and culture and what our place in it should be. Yeah. And it's so out of control, so dysfunctional, as you know, today.
But I like what you said at the beginning. We are here because God placed us here, which
That's right.
means He's going to give us what we need to cope.
That's right. That's right. And he expects us to use our spiritual gifts and our mental faculties to be a source of salt and light, a source of light and love and hope and truth in the midst of a society and culture that's just absolutely coming apart at the seams. Yes, Ray?
On jazz, I like jazz because the different parts during a song, who they would get the lead to somebody,
Yeah.
the drummer, the trumpet,
Yeah.
or whatever, and they will play, and everybody else will support that,
Mhm.
and then somebody else.
They
will
call
take
it
over.
trading eights.
So
by
it's
the
a
way.
humility of stepping back and let somebody else take the front stage.
Yeah, that's right.
And then-
Well, bluegrass music does that too,
and
actually.
then
Yeah.
taking your time.
Mhm.
That jazz
Mhm.
was everybody putting themselves forward all
That's
at
right.
the same time.
They're all doing their own thing. Yeah. And it's intentional because there's no intention of creating melodic, harmonious music.
And that concept of freedom
Mhm.
really is just bondage.
That's right. That's right.
It's
But they
bondage to
think,
chaos.
in a purposeless world, it's the best we can aspire to is individual freedom as they define it. Well, I'm sorry, that's not a very uplifting thing to end with. I thought we'd get a little bit further this evening, but we'll pick up at this point next week. Comment or question? Yeah, comment or
In
question?
terms of your comments on music tonight, your whole presentation, how do you fit what I consider to be what music is today? Most of it is what they call rap.
Well,
Where they just talking through it.
Well, there is rap. There's also, of course, I don't even know what to call a lot of this white pop music. Honestly, I'm quite ignorant. I have no interest in it. The kind of stuff that like Britney Spears or somebody like that makes. And I don't even know how to classify it.
They just call it pop.
What?
They just call it pop music.
Just pop music. Okay, yeah.
Trendy
yeah.
stuff, mostly.
So again, we'll pick up at this point next week and I think make considerably more progress toward where we're heading in this course. But thank you for your indulgence. Nobody walked out in protest during either of those pieces of music I played. And so very much looking forward to going through this material. It's very, very rich material. And I think you'll find Schaeffer's life extremely interesting. His ministry is very unique ministry that he started in Switzerland based on a community called L'Abri, and then his great writings and all. So I think you'll find it very, very stimulating. And I appreciate your involvement. If you haven't had a chance yet to register, please check with my wife back here in the burgundy top. And so blessings on your week. Good being with you. Look forward to continuing next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all who joined us online as well.
Yeah.